Okay, perfect. And in addition to that, I just want to let you also know that we have live transcription available for this session. So if you want to enable that feature, you just need to hit the live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Okay, all right, we can go ahead and get started. I'm Jillian Moyes, and I'm a PhD candidate in sociology, as well as this year's graduate student advisor to the Dean and Chancellor. And so this Tuesday Talks with Alumni speaker series was developed as part of my GSADC project in collaboration with key graduate studies staff, including Jessica Fela Ward, who's joining us on the call today. This spring quarter series is designed to provide graduate students an opportunity to informally connect with advanced degree alumni who successfully navigated graduate school at UC Davis and who come from diverse academic fields and professional backgrounds. So this is our second to last session. Each alum so far has shared their experiences and personal perspectives on a professional development topic of their choosing. So after today's session, we will have one more final session, and I'll make sure to drop the link in the chat at some point before the end of our talk today. So just a couple of quick housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. So we'll just ask for you to please remember to keep your mics muted during the talk. And after the talk, we'll have roughly between 15 and 20 minutes for questions, at which point you can use the raise hand function or type your questions in the chat, which I will read aloud. So without further delay, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, who will be giving a presentation today on finding academic success in the nonprofit world. Reverend Dr. Mae Elise Cannon is the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace and an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Her ministry and professional background includes serving as the Senior Director of Advocacy and Outreach for World Vision US, the Executive Pastor of Hillside Covenant Church in Walnut Creek, California, Director of Development and Transformation for Extension Ministries at Willow Creek Community Church in Barrington, Illinois, and as a consultant to the Middle East for child advocacy issues for Compassion International. She earned doctorates in history and spiritual formation. Her PhD focused on American history with a minor in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of California, Davis, focusing her dissertation on the history of the American Protestant Church in Israel and Palestine. Cannon's Doctorate of Ministry and Spiritual Formation is from Northern Theological Seminary, and Cannon also holds a Master's in Divinity from North Park Theological Seminary, an MBA from North Park University School of Business and Nonprofit Management, and an MA in bioethics from Trinity International University. Cannon completed her Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Chicago in History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Science and Medicine. Please help me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Cannon. You have the floor, Mae.
Thank you, Jillian.
You're welcome.
Good to be here, and welcome to all of you. I'd be interested to know, if you're willing, if you'd drop a little introduction in the chat in terms of who you are or what your program is or why you might be interested in this conversation. My hope is that our time together can be the most constructive for you where you're at in your own vocational career, and that I could tell you some of the mistakes I made, some of the opportunities that are certainly on the horizon. People often ask, how can I get into the nonprofit world in Washington, D.C.? And some of what I want to talk about is access to the nonprofit community. And then what does academic success look like in that context and framework? So you heard a bit of my background. I always considered myself an avocational academic, so I'm so proud to actually be having a conversation with, my alma mater where I got my PhD. I was a bit of a bivocational student. I don't know how many of you are, full-time students or might have other work, but my primary vocation initially was actually in ministry. As a pastor, I'm ordained in one of the few evangelical denominations that ordains women. I sometimes say not that kind of evangelical, as evangelical has been in the news quite a bit over the last several years. And I wanted to do my doctorate because I wanted to have the opportunity to delve more deeply into academic rigor. I had several master's degrees in diverse fields. You heard an MBA, a divinity degree, a Master of Arts in bioethics. And, I originally thought that I would go to UC Davis and do my PhD in US history studying the question of the role of religion in domestic social reform, which certainly is very relevant to this moment in time. You may know that next week is the year anniversary of the death of George Floyd. And if you've been looking and paying attention to the conversation about race, and the conversation about racial injustice and police violence, I mean, I don't know how we couldn't be paying attention to it, but I thought that I was going to write about the role of religion, specifically Christianity and the church, and the Black church specifically, in civil rights movements and in social reform movements. And then I had a transformative international experience as a pastor. I went on a spiritual pilgrimage to Israel and was introduced to a conflict that I knew nothing about, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I came back to my dissertation advisor, Clarence Walker. I was serving as a pastor at the time in Walnut Creek, California, in the East Bay. And I came back from this international experience and I said, Clarence, I want to write about Israel. And he jokingly said, you know, you're getting your PhD in American history, right? But then I ended up doing my dissertation on the role of the American church and the history of American Protestant engagement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if you're paying any attention to the news right now, there is significant escalation of that conflict. It's been going on for about 2 weeks. There's been a number of things that have been happening that are the latest kind of matchbox, if you will, of igniting that violence. And so my work now as the executive director of Churches for Middle East Peace is a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., focuses on religious peace building that taps deeply, deeply, deeply into, you know, the PhD work and the doctoral work I did at Davis. And so, you know, it's been a bit of a journey. So for me, I never really thought that I would pursue a tenured track position. I had experience in the local church context. I've shifted the focus of my PhD work towards the Middle East. And upon graduation with my doctorate, you know, one of the things I always heard is when you get your PhD, all of the opportunities will come knocking. Well, maybe you are the exception to the rule. I don't think it quite works that way. I think the PhD and graduate education opens up doors. I think it gives certainly academic credibility. It gives credentials that can allow people to want to hear from you more because you not only have experience, you have academic education to further substantiate, you know, your perspective on certain issues. But graduate education is not the silver bullet, I guess you would say, that many people at least whispered in my ear, you know, in terms of once one received the PhD. And so from that, I finished my PhD and ended up living in Israel. While I was doing my doctoral work, I had the privilege of living there in 2010 and 2011 in Jerusalem. I was doing research, certainly for the dissertation, but I was also working for a nonprofit when I was there. And one of the things that the research process allows in the nonprofit world is that nonprofits want to be credible in whatever field they're in. They want to have access to experts. And so even if they're not a think tank, they want to substantiate the work that they're doing by evidence and by research. And so one of the unique roles for master's students and particularly for doctoral students, one of the unique roles that you might play for a nonprofit in the future is by playing that role of informing the work of the nonprofit, by tapping into what is academia saying about the field, you know, that nonprofit is focused on. And so my specific nonprofit experience is in the development world. Is in international development, focused specifically on the Middle East. And so I worked for a nonprofit called Compassion International. I was doing a research project. I was hired actually to write for them and to do a research project on the Middle East because they had programs all over the world in India and Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. And their goal was to alleviate extreme poverty, and they had no programs in the Middle East. So they hired me as a doctoral student to live in the Middle East and to do research about what opportunities they were to be able to respond specifically to poverty in that context. From that position, I ended up transitioning out of the local church as my primary vocational focus into full-time nonprofit work, where I transitioned and began to work for an organization called World Vision. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's another Christian international development agency. Compassion size is about $1 billion in terms of their donations annually, and World Vision is about twice as big, so about 2.2 billion at the time, which are not small nonprofits. I mean, that's the nonprofit I lead now has a budget of less than $1 million. So there's the scope of opportunities in the nonprofit world in terms of size and resources in that regard. And for World Vision, I was overseeing World Vision's work specifically related to advocacy around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but around the realities facing children in the Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and children in other parts of the Middle East, and paying close attention to how conflict affects the life of children. So what does all this have to do with your graduate work and PhDs, et cetera? And I thought that I would just highlight a few things that I hope could be an encouragement to you on your own journey in terms of if you're looking to be an academic in the nonprofit world, what are some things that you can do? And so certainly finishing your studies, being diligent in your studies. And I would encourage you to be as active as you can while you're a student as well. You can volunteer, you can be a fellow. We hire academic fellows as an opportunity to give them opportunities to write and to have a platform to write from. So we have a fellowship that's named after my predecessor called the Ambassador Warren Clark Fellowship. And just to give you an idea of what that fellowship looks like, we've had about half a dozen fellows over the last 5 years or so. And fellows are co-writing books with me. I've published or edited 6 volumes, some academic, some popular books. And so one of the things that you can do is volunteer. Volunteer or be an intern, or if you want something a bit more prestigious, pursue fellowships as an academic. And so thank you. Christina just introduced herself in the chat. I'd love for all of you to introduce yourself because I really want to hear what would be most helpful in terms of our conversation together. So what are some of the things you can do? The first one is be active. The second one is write. Try to get published wherever you can. Popular publications might not be esteemed in the academy, but popular publications are just as legitimate, if not more legitimate, in the nonprofit world. And so if you're able to, publish an op-ed, that's a great place to start. Publish a short article. Blogs are legitimate, but find a blog that's by another nonprofit. I publish things all the time, by different denominations that are a part of Churches for Middle East Peace. And so I really would encourage you to write. And I think popular writing is a starting point. Try to get some things published in academic writing as well. That only helps substantiate your CV, but also your credibility as you're looking for nonprofit jobs. You can publish articles, you can publish chapters. I have yet to publish a book with a university press, but I have several chapters by university presses on certain issues related to social justice and related to the Middle East. I have one academic book that I co-edited by an academic press, but it wasn't a university press. And so one of my goals to stay in the academic world is to pursue further publication, by university presses. So be active, write. And then the third thing I would suggest is apply for grants and for financial resources. There are tons and tons of resources out there for graduate students. And I remember one of the great privileges I had when I was a student at UC Davis was almost every time I went to Israel to do research in the archives there, I received quite a bit of funding to be able to really help those experiences. And so I'd encourage you to look at where are there the academic societies that are related to your field. As you engage in academic societies, it helps keep your foot in the academic world while you're doing nonprofit work. So for me, I'm a member of the American Academy of Religion. I actually had a chapter published in an academic book because I presented a paper at the American Academy of Religion, and we'll be doing so again this year. That's a primary place where academics and practitioners in my field are able to engage. I'm a member of the American Historical Society, the Evangelical Theological Society. Academic societies can sometimes provide opportunities for grants and funding, which will really help to be able to expand your experience. And then speaking of which, number 4, no experience that you have will be wasted. So if you really want to be in the nonprofit world, what people will look at on your resume are your academic credentials and also your work experience, but your tangible experience at engaging in whatever question you're trying to address. So if it's an educational nonprofit, if you have volunteer experience for a few years, or as an intern or as a fellow, those types of experiential components of your resume are going to be quite significant. And in the world I'm in Washington, D.C., I'll be very honest with you, when we're hiring, we're looking not for one thing, not for two things. We're looking for 3 primary things. We're looking for how educated are people, and master's degrees are becoming increasingly common. So almost all of our staff, right now we have anywhere between 15 and 20 people that work at Churches for Middle East Peace, between volunteers, fellows, part-time staff, full-time staff. Almost all of them have master's degrees. And I don't say that to discourage you, but in Washington, D.C., it's kind of the new norm, if you will. And so if you are a master's student, some of the things you need to be thinking about is what's going to set you aside from other candidates who, have similar levels of education. PhDs are still in the nonprofit world considered exceptional. You're all exceptional. So I'm being very direct in terms of what it means to have your feet in the nonprofit world. But the first thing we look for is education. The second thing we look for is that experience. Do you have a couple of years really doing work that can help bring a skill or a strength to the nonprofit organization? Even if it's, a few years working for, a for-profit firm, or, even if it's out of the industry, real work experience is incredibly valuable in the nonprofit world. Because a lot of people go into nonprofit work because they're idealists. You want to leave the world a better place. You want to tackle an issue. You want to fight injustice, which are all good things. But we want people to work in that industry who have skills that can help us then accomplish our organizational goals. So your studies are critical, your experience is critical. And in Washington, D.C., the third component really is international experience. That to be able to have, another way of putting it is to be in the field. So if you're working on domestic issues, it wouldn't be that you have international experience, it would be that you have experience in the field addressing whatever issue it is, that the nonprofit you're working alongside or want to work for is seeking to address. And I will tell you, we get so many candidates that have 2 of the 3. And because the candidate pool is so qualified, because education, so many people applying are increasingly educated, those differentials of having all 3 of those aspects, education, experience, and then the field work, is really what differentiates candidates in terms of the nonprofit world. So I think those were kind of my main notes. I'll take a minute and catch up on the chat here. Is it too soon to go into discussion and question and answer, Jillian?
Well, there's a little bit more time if there was anything else that you wanted to add for your presentation before we get to questions, but if you're ready for questions, we can do that as well.
I think maybe, I'm sure more will come up as we converse, but I'd love to hear, who's in the room, what sector of nonprofits are you looking at in terms of, what's it mean to be an academic in a nonprofit? I think that would help me in terms of knowing what would be best. and most constructive.
That's perfect. So we have some folks who shared a little bit about what they're doing in the nonprofit world. So maybe we could take a look at those comments, and then we have a question also from Anka. Would you like to start with Anka's question?
Sure. Let me see. I see Christina's. Oh, there it is.
So what would be the first step when it comes to writing?
Yes. So Anka, help me understand what's your field, if you would. Sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot. International peace education. So I think the first step is to see who's already talking about the issues that you care about. You know, the nonprofits that you want to pursue, work with or work alongside, because academics can certainly be a resource, you know, for nonprofits, even if you're not employed by the nonprofit. And so, you know, I'll just use my work as an example. I haven't really told you about it. Let me just take a minute and tell you about Churches for Middle East Peace. So Churches for Middle East Peace is a nonprofit that's been around for almost 40 years. It was founded in the 1980s by a number of church denominations, a number of traditional denominations, Orthodox, the traditional churches of the Holy Land, Israel and the Palestinian territories. They're called communions. And so 30 of these denominations today exist to promote an end to conflict in the Middle East. And our mechanism of promoting peace in the Middle East is by educating the American government to have more informed policy positions, specifically towards Israel-Palestine, but towards the broader Middle East. So we are a religious peace-building institution. We work with the heads of communion, we work with the top leaders of church denominations, and we work with the heads of government. So we have a meeting Thursday this week with the White House to, you know, call on President Biden with this recent conflict to call for a ceasefire. If you're paying attention to what's happening right now in Gaza and the devastating effect of the recent escalations on particularly Palestinians in Gaza. In the last week, for example, 60 children in Gaza alone were killed. And so Churches for Middle East Peace exists as an educational nonprofit that does advocacy to educate about peace building in the Middle East. And in terms of, you know, going back to the question of writing, we want to write to our primary constituents, our American Christians. We, of course, work more broadly. We work in an interfaith context. We work with Jewish organizations. We work with Arab organizations, Palestinian groups. We work with Muslims, Jews, Christians. So the first question in terms of writing is, you know, what's the issue you want to address and who else is writing about it? So for us, religious peace building, there's a few core places that are paying attention to that. Religious news services is one of the most popular religious outlets that doesn't just write about the Middle East, but writes about global religious issues. We've published op-eds for them quite significantly. We just had an article come out in an organization called Sojourners that is a Christian social magazine, if you will, that writes about domestic and global justice issues. So if you are, Anka, you know, volunteering in an international peace education, who's writing about international peace education? What are the sources? What are the popular sources? And then what are the academic sources? So for us, we often will write an article and we might write it for a popular source, and then we'll go and write about the same issue, but really cite our evidence. We'll use citations, we'll write much more academically. So we have an article coming out in the Journal of Religions, for example, on the relationship between the veneration of icons in traditional Orthodox worship versus evangelical use of icons, which doesn't relate specifically to the Middle East, but relates to, you know, our broad ecumenical religious work. I have an article that I'm writing for the American Academy of Religion right now about minority Christian communities on the border in Iraq. If you're familiar with the Assyrian Christian community there, or the Kurdish community in northern Iraq, Kurdistan, religious peace building is a critical issue for those communities. And so we're writing an article for the American Academy of Religion that'll be addressing that issue. So finding out who's writing about it, what are the topics they're addressing, you could start with op-eds. One of the things that you could do to start writing if you've never published anything on your own is find a mentor who might co-write with you. So our greatest opportunities for fellows is I have them co-write with me. They will often do the research. I'll help direct the programmatic focus. We'll co-edit together and then we'll publish together because I have credentials and an organization, et cetera, behind me. And so a number of places will publish my things, whereas they might not publish a master's student, their article. And so you can find people who will write alongside of you, particularly in academic writing. It's very common to not have singularly authored pieces. So I think that's kind of a great way to start.
So we have another question from, and please forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Essie, who is a PhD student in material science and has started a small nonprofit last year for children in socioeconomically disadvantaged areas in Turkey to help reduce the gap in access to education. So Essie says, this is out of the area of expertise for me or my project partners. What would you recommend for those who are starting projects or nonprofits out of their areas of expertise?
Sure. Well, it's interesting to be speaking to a group of academics about this. I would start with research. I mean, if you are working in an area where you are not an expert, and I often say, I have my PhD on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and anyone who tells you they're an expert on it, they're a fool. So I would maintain a posture of learning in whatever your field might be. And in that regard, the things that I would research is what's been done that's been effective and what's been ineffective. There's often a lot of materials out there in different fields on where is success and what does success look like. But the other thing I would research is who else is doing the work. It's critically important in nonprofit work to not presume that you have an answer that someone else has not already come up with. And I could almost guarantee other people have not only come up with it, they came up with it 50 years before you thought of it or even were born. And so to build on the expertise of the nonprofit world is really critical in terms of a posture of humility and learning. And you will, of course, add value. Your work, your experience, your unique background and contributions will be able to help grow what already exists, but work with what already exists. Seek to honor the nonprofits that are in the space also as you are birthing a new nonprofit or engaging in an issue. I think that's really critical in terms of efficacy in the long run.
Thank you. So do we have additional questions? Feel free again to place them in the chat or to raise your hand, at which point you can unmute yourself and ask your question out loud if you'd like. We have lots of time for questions, so don't be shy.
I'm trying to think what wisdom I might have to offer you. We have been in the throes of it this week and certainly last week with everything that's happening on the ground in Palestine and in Israel. I'm curious, for those of you who are here, if the interest is, that you want to be academics in the nonprofit space, or are you thinking that academic work, it's harder to find, tenure track positions, are so competitive. So you're looking for alternative fields to be able to use your expertise. I'm curious why this particular topic might be of interest to many of you.
Maybe if folks can just kind of drop in the chat 1 or 2 words in response to that question, that might be helpful.
And while you're doing that, I do think another opportunity for academics are think tanks. I'd heard of think tanks when I was in the academic world, but until I actually got to DC, I had this kind of, esoteric conception of what they might mean. But think tanks can be an incredible opportunity if you care about a certain issue to be able to do a research project. They often have great fellowships. They often have funding for their fellowships. So, as you have certain questions that you're considering, or in your field, I'm familiar. I'm sure there are think tanks in other places other than Washington, D.C., but those are the ones that I'm the most familiar with as a starting point. So for us, some of the places I would recommend, like the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a government agency, not an independent think tank, but they're doing some great work and having great conversations. We work closely with the Carnegie Institute, I think is the full name of it, as a think tank that does research with academics. Interestingly, a lot of attorneys rather than PhDs, but human rights attorneys doing research and work on the Middle East. So think tanks are another viable alternative in the nonprofit world.
So we have Erica who shared, I'm starting a hydrology PhD and considering nonprofit afterwards. And then Christina, who's not sure if I want to do the tenure track or do my own work for my community.
And my encouragement for you along the way, and I mentioned this before in terms of the experience, Scarlett, that's my Great Dane that just came to say hello. So I'm really proud that they're not barking. So we're having a good conversation thus far. For those of you, who are right in the middle of your studies, I would seek to do things now that really keep your options open when you have, either completed your comps or finished your dissertations. And so the things that you can be doing along the way is publishing. I mean, you really can publish while you are still a grad student. And so I would look for opportunities in that regard. And even if you can have touch points with potential nonprofits that are in your industry or in your field. I can't say enough, if for some reason, 3 or 4 years down the road, or however long it is, when you do graduate and finish your degree, if you decide then that you want to go into the nonprofit world, it'll take 2 to 3 years to build up certain things in your resume if you haven't started already while you're doing your studies. And so, some of that can be done, taking summers. I'm working right now. One of our fellows is a PhD student from Princeton, and he's writing quite a bit with me. He will leave this fellowship with us at Churches for Middle East Peace, having published somewhere between 12 and 15 popular articles, of which 3 or 4 of them are peer-reviewed academic articles, which is so prolific in the academic world. I mean, I'm so proud of him. And that helps us organizationally. We're being prolific, we're engaging. And I think that's one of the great assets, even as graduate students, you can offer to nonprofits, is you can help them be relevant in their field. So if there's, a hydrology PhD, if there's a nonprofit related to hydrology, if there's a question you think a nonprofit can help contribute an answer to, go to them and say, hey, I'd love to write a research article. Could I work with one of your scientists, or could I work with one of your staff to help inform your research, with the goal of, and say, I'd love to either feature them as the content of the article, or to say, hey, could I write this and be identified as a fellow, or be identified, with their organization, which gives them credibility and gives you credibility. And then you have this incredible, peer-reviewed academic article to be able to put on your resume when 3 or 4 years down the road, you're going to nonprofits to say, look at what an asset I am to you. And so I think that's really, really a valuable opportunity for you with where you are right now.
And you just touched on this a little bit, Mae, but Jessica just asked, how important is networking in the nonprofit world, and how does one get started with networking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish, I'm a bit of an introvert. I'd rather read a book than talk to people. You're all academics. I would imagine you like to read at least a little bit. Networking is so ridiculously critically important. And disproportionately so. You could be the best candidate. You could be, the most astute academic in terms of your thinking, in terms of your writing, in terms of your articulation. And if you have not been in conversation with the players in the field that you are in, I hate to say it, but you might be overlooked. And so in that regard, I always talk about networking with integrity. I'm not talking about being utilitarian and developing relationships, just for the purpose of advancing your career. But if you really want to work alongside of a nonprofit that is doing work in a certain space, find out who the players are in that space. Reach out to them, introduce yourself. If there's opportunities to do events, when nonprofits are hosting events, often board members come, or I'm trying to think of what that might look like in our space. Our space is a bit unique, being a religious nonprofit, but we work with government, we work with religious leaders, we work with secular activists and advocacy groups. And so on different issues, there are often coalitions that are several organizations, and maybe the organizations don't necessarily agree on policy, and they might be across the spectrum in terms of their perspectives of the ways that they're addressing issues, but knowing who they are and being engaged with them is critically, critically important.
I'm thinking about Christina's comment a little bit, and I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to if someone is sort of thinking about the traditional academic track versus perhaps branching out into the nonprofit world. What are some opportunities that maybe the nonprofit world opens up that perhaps that would not be available in academia?
Sure. Well, we talk often about the ivory tower of academia, and the nonprofit world allows you to put what you are studying and researching and writing about into practice. And so that's the greatest privilege of my work. Not only do I get to write, I'm a historian by training in terms of my academic field, and the history of the Middle East certainly informs the realities of the Middle East. But I get to play a role in being in conversation with global leaders that are contributing to the Lord willing conflict mitigation in the Middle East. And so, opportunities I've had from that, I've spoken at the United Nations. I've had the opportunity to meet with heads of state, certainly members of Congress, the White House, the State Department, that degree of influence and immediate contact in terms of influence, because I think academics shape the way we think. They shape the conversation. I think that's incredibly influential, but sometimes it's removed. You don't actually get to see, is your theory or is your idea or is what you believe being able to be put into practice? And if it is, what's that look like? And is it having impact? And is it making a difference? And where do you need to hone your thinking? So in that regard, being in the field is such a great privilege in a unique way. I think it's just different for academics who are tenured. I will say as well, I'm an adjunct faculty member at 4 or 5 academic institutions, so I still get to teach. And so that's really fun. I mentioned some of the books that I've published. I've published 3 independently on evangelical engagement in social justice. That's my background outside of the context of the Middle East, which was why I wanted to write about the role of religion in domestic social reform. And so I have these books coming out or that have already been published about domestic justice issues. And the most recent one just came out a year ago. It was called Beyond #Activism, Comprehensive Justice in a Complicated Age. And that was written in the context of courses that I taught in Bethlehem. I taught a course, I'm an adjunct faculty member at a small school in Hawaii. And so being able to teach a class on social justice and race in Hawaii, the only state in the United States that is minority white, the term for white people in Hawaii is haole, which literally means empty breath. Does anyone know where that comes from? In the native Hawaiian indigenous culture, the Hawaiians used to greet by touching their foreheads. And when you touch your forehead to one another, you breathe on one another. And the Hawaiians believed that when you greeted one another, you shared your soul by sharing your breath upon another. And so you touch foreheads. And so when white people and colonizers came to Hawaii, they no longer greeted forehead to forehead, they greeted by shaking one another's hands. And so the term haole empty-breathed ones is the term for white people in the context of Hawaii. And so that's an example of, here I'm writing this book about racial justice in the context that, in Hawaii, that's in the field, that's on the ground, that's very, very different, than Washington, D.C., if you will.
Thank you for that, Mae. I had no idea. That was really fascinating information. And I see Christina shared that that's the same as the Maori people. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly as well. So other questions, again, feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand.
My thoughts are now going to the way that white people are identified in different cultures. I speak Mandarin Chinese and had the privilege of living in Taiwan and in mainland China. Does anyone know the word for white people in Mandarin? It literally translates, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to be a racial justice conversation, but it's relevant to the nonprofit work that I do. The word for white people in Mandarin is Waiguoren, which literally means foreign white devil. And so it's just interesting the way when you look at race and language, it's just an interesting question and point of discussion. Yes.
So we have, oh, okay.
It's those who write about us.
Very fast, very interesting. Northern Paiute. Thank you.
I'm telling you, I want someone coming out of this conversation to write an article about the identification of whiteness but in different languages. I think that's quite a story to be told. I'm sorry, that's tangential though. I see Yasmin's question there.
Oh, yes, I missed that. Sorry. Thank you.
No. It just says, could you please explain a little more about the different types of nonprofits that do work for environment and climate change? There's a number of international development organizations that emphasize climate as a key priority. So, and that's, like I said, the background that I have been in, international organizations that are focused on poverty. And you are probably familiar that the global poor are those the most affected negatively by pollution and by environmental justice issues. And so environmental justice and environment and climate change is not my field per se. I do know a number of development agencies focus significantly on environment and climate change. There are some that's the specific focus of. There's a lot happening right now on nonprofits that are looking for alternative energy sources as a means of course, combating climate change and addressing issues within the environment. And then, this is a little outside of the conversation in terms of nonprofits. There are government agencies that focus on those things too. And so often there is a relationship between academia on one side, government on another side, and nonprofits as kind of civil societies work on those same questions. And so there can be a lot of intersection. So a lot of the nonprofits that work on issues like environment and climate change work very closely with the Environmental Protection Agency. And a little tidbit story in that regard, one of the people I worked with when I was at World Vision was doing environmental development work. He worked at the EPA before he worked at World Vision, and the EPA did not start recycling. This is totally just a little anecdote. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, did not start recycling until like in the last 10 years. So he was one of the people that was like, hey, the key focus of this organization is the environment, the government's engagement in terms of protection. And, we're talking about the impacts of pollution, the impacts on the environment. Don't you think we should recycle? Which I thought was quite an interesting anecdote. And so a lot of what's needed within nonprofits is also the integrity of, the very issues you're trying to address and to change. Are you having organizational integrity in terms of the application of those issues? And so the EPA needed a little help in that regard back in the day.
Thank you. And I see that Christina also shared a link for the Environmental Indigenous Network. So for Yasmin. So thank you, Christina. And as we're waiting for any final questions, I just put the chat or a link in the chat for the Tuesday Talks website, where you can find all of the previously recorded sessions, as well as the registration for the remaining session next week.
That's great. Yeah.
Other questions you might have?
Maybe while you're thinking about a last question, I don't know if any of you are in the nonprofit world right now as students. I was a bit nervous as a doctoral student, one being bivocational. Academics can have a tendency, with all due respect to my academic colleagues, can have a tendency to be a bit insular in not wanting to engage with people outside of their discipline. And Clarence Walker, as my dissertation advisor, was absolutely fabulous, was just so incredible at seeing my work outside of academia as an asset. Sometimes in academia, that will be a prejudice that you experience, where if you are outside of academia, you will be viewed as not quite legitimate. Right. And so I think just knowing that the credentials of academia can open up doors in the nonprofit world, but sometimes that's not reciprocal. If you have nonprofit experience, unless it's something like, oh, you were the former Secretary of State, we always tease Georgetown, if you go and work for the US government and have a high appointed position, you'll get a job at Georgetown afterwards, which is a little tongue in cheek, but also true. And so that's one of the dynamics that you might experience as an academic, who is seeking credibility in the academic world while also trying to explore what it might look like to work in a nonprofit.
Thank you. And I saw Christina put in a link to a meeting coming up on a seminar on climate change impact. So thank you. I clicked on that. It looks really interesting. Thank you, Christina. All right. So I have one question if no one else has questions. I actually lived in DC for a brief, relatively brief 7 years. And I know that there's a lot of nonprofit opportunities in DC I worked in nonprofits when I was living there as well. But I wonder for folks maybe who want to move to areas where there maybe it's a little bit more difficult to find work in the nonprofit sector. What are some concrete ways in terms of looking for these kinds of jobs? So I know there's idealists, for instance, but maybe beyond that, how might someone look for opportunities in nonprofits?
Sure. I think we use Indeed also. I think we post a lot of our positions on, so I would look at who are those search engines that are posting jobs. I would not be, if you have the time and space to take 3 months or 6 months, to do something like an internship. If you look, and I would just say you have to search and Google. I don't know the answer to the specifics in terms of what the sites would be, if it's Indeed or Idealist, or, take a look at LinkedIn. Having an up-to-date LinkedIn profile, it might seem antiquated in terms of the social media world, but a lot of nonprofits still use it. And you can actually pay a little bit more to get a professional version of LinkedIn, where they will put your resume and put your information in front of nonprofits and give you kind of more access to help you find jobs. That's a little less specific to academia, but that's at least a resource you could use in that regard. But I will say we have found some of the most incredible staff, and we're a little bit unique because we're based in Washington, D.C., but we have staff all over the world. So we have staff that work with us from Jerusalem. Our finance manager lives in Arkansas. I'm right now in Washington State. And so increasingly, and particularly because of the coronavirus and the Zoom world, increasingly there will be opportunities to work for nonprofits, in DC, even if you're in California. But I do think, and I just can't say this enough, if you're willing to say, hey, I'm going to take this summer, I'll give 15 to 20 hours a week as an intern. I mean, I know, we often will hire interns that are so overqualified to be interns, but within 6 months, we're able to hire them full time. And a lot of nonprofits can't make that promise. But when you get your foot in the door of a nonprofit, in terms of how do you network, how do you know what the core issues are organizationally, how do you have opportunities to write, I would just say, and you can even negotiate when you take internships and say, I'd really like to put this on my resume and use this title instead. So we'll hire interns and then just call it a coordinator or call it something else to really help people be able to build up, their resume and their experience. But as you're able to do that, it's invaluable. And sometimes it takes, you have to swallow your pride a little in terms of it might not be a director title or a senior director title, or it might not come, a lot of nonprofits don't have money immediately. And so the limits of resources within the nonprofit world is a reality. But when you prove your worth and when you come in and have credentials and experience and passion and drivenness, often opportunities can arise that weren't anticipated. And so I think, those things that I talked about of the experience, like work experience, and then being on the ground and then writing and credentials, I talked about a lot, but I think all those things are really important.
Thank you, Mae. Okay, so any last questions? We do have a couple of minutes left, but if not, we can maybe give everyone a little time back. Any final questions anyone might have? I want to make sure I don't overlook anyone. Okay, well, before we officially close, I do want to just share that next week again will be the last Tuesday talk, and that will be focusing on establishing your professional profile. So there's the specific link to that Tuesday talk. And I want to just thank you again, Mae Cannon, for just being generous with your time and really giving us an excellent presentation on academic success in the nonprofit world. And I also want to thank all of our participants for joining us this afternoon. And hopefully you'll join us for our final session next week. And just as a final reminder for all of the students who are student attendees, so that's graduate and professional students, as well as any undergraduate students who might have joined us, you earn one entry into a drawing for one of five $50 Visa gift cards. And that will be, the winners will be contacted at the end of the speaker series at the end of this month. So unless there are any final comments, have a great afternoon. I will stick around if anyone has a question. I'll stick around for a couple of minutes, but have a great afternoon. Thank you again so much, Mae.
Great. Thank you, Jillian. Good to be with you.
Appreciate it.